The alarms were already screaming when I stepped onto the bridge, and nobody had to tell me why. Red light washed over every panel. Laura Bennett stood at the tactical station with her jaw tight, watching 3 unknown fleets drop out of warp less than 200,000 kilometers from our border marker. I had exactly 4 seconds to decide what kind of day this was going to be, and I decided it was going to be the day everyone finally understood what we had been telling them for 11 years. My name is Daniel Cross. I was a junior liaison the first time Earth stood in front of the Galactic Council and said, plainly, that we were choosing to hold ourselves back. I remember the room. I remember the silence that followed, and then the laughter that came after the silence. Quiet at first, then not quiet at all. Nobody believed a species that had only just learned to fold space could possibly be sitting on more than it showed. They assumed our restraint was a lie, built to cover weakness. They were wrong, and I was one of the very few people in that chamber who actually understood how wrong. 11 years earlier, when Earth first made contact with the wider galaxy, we were handed a simple choice: show everything we had, or show only what was necessary to survive first contact without triggering panic on either side. Our scientists had already pushed past several technological walls that the rest of the galaxy considered fixed limits. Our engineers had already solved problems that other species had given up on centuries earlier. If we had walked into that first meeting with everything on display, half the room would have called it a threat, and the other half would have started planning how to take it from us. So we chose the quiet path. We showed them ships that were merely competent. We showed them weapons that were merely adequate. We kept everything else folded away, locked behind classification levels that even most of our own diplomats never saw. I was one of the people who helped write the warning. It was not hidden. It was not a secret whispered in back rooms. It was said clearly, on the record, in front of every delegate from every member species of the Council. We are choosing restraint. We are showing you a fraction of what we can do. Please do not mistake caution for the limit of our ability. I watched the delegate from the Threll Assembly write something down, and then set his stylus aside with an expression that told me he had already stopped listening. I watched the Vantaru ambassador smile the particular smile of someone who has decided you are lying to save face. Nobody wrote it into policy. Nobody adjusted a single strategic assumption. They simply filed it under the same drawer as every other new species that walked in nervous and overstated its own importance. For a while, that was fine. We built our colonies. We opened trade routes. We learned the shape of the galaxy, who held power, who resented that power, and who was simply waiting for an opening. Kepler's Reach was our furthest colony at the time, 3 jumps past the edge of Council territory, home to a little over 400,000 people who had left Earth to build something new, under a sky that wasn't ours. I had a cousin out there, her name was Grace, and she used to send me pictures of the twin moons rising over the wheat fields, because she said nobody back home would believe how strange and beautiful it looked. The warnings we gave were never dramatic. We never threatened anyone. We never postured the way some species did, puffing up their fleets in a show of strength meant to intimidate before a single word was spoken. Our approach was almost apologetic. We would tell trade partners, quietly, that our shown capabilities were a baseline, not a ceiling. We would tell military observers, during joint exercises, that what they were watching was the version of us built for cooperation, not the version built for conflict. Officers from 3 different alliances watched our ships perform basic maneuvers and walked away writing reports that used words like modest and unremarkable. I read some of those reports later. They were not wrong about what they saw. They were wrong about what it meant. The Council itself had a strange relationship with humanity. They needed our system for its position along a valuable trade corridor. They wanted access to a handful of resources our system happened to be rich in. But they also treated us the way a large family treats a distant, slightly odd relative who showed up unannounced and asked to stay for dinner. Polite, tolerated, never quite trusted with anything important. We were kept out of the higher council chambers, where real decisions were made. Our representatives were seated near the back during major votes. When trade disputes arose between older, more established species, we were expected to simply accept whatever terms were handed down, because our fleet numbers looked small on paper, and our history in the galaxy was barely more than a decade old. I did not resent this, not at first. I understood it. Every new arrival has to earn a place. What began to trouble me was not the condescension itself, but how deeply it shaped their assumptions about what we might do if pushed. They believed, with total confidence, that Earth had no real teeth. They believed our restraint was proof of limitation, rather than proof of choice. And the more we told them otherwise, calmly, honestly, without threat, the more convinced they became that we were simply trying to sound bigger than we were. The clearest moment came during a routine session, the one people now call the day of dismissal, though nobody used that name for it at the time. A senior fleet officer from Earth, a woman named Helen Marchetti, stood before the assembled delegates and gave what should have been an unremarkable procedural briefing about our defensive posture along the border. Partway through, she set the prepared notes aside and spoke without them. She told the council, in careful, measured words, that humanity had never shown its full military or technological capacity to any outside power. She explained that this was a deliberate policy, chosen to prevent unnecessary conflict during a period when our understanding of galactic politics was still incomplete. She said that our restraint should not be mistaken for the boundary of what we could do, and that any future aggression against Earth or its territories would be met with a response calibrated to the actual threat, not the reduced posture we had shown until then. I was standing near the observation gallery when she said it. I watched the reaction ripple through the chamber, delegate by delegate, species by species. Amusement. A few polite nods that meant nothing. One representative actually laughed, a short, involuntary sound quickly covered by a cough. The formal record shows the council chair thanking Officer Marchetti for her candor, and moving directly to the next item on the agenda without a single follow-up question. No one asked what our full capacity actually was. No one asked why a species would deliberately underperform in front of potential rivals. They simply closed the file. I remember walking out of that chamber beside Marchetti, and I remember what she said to me in the corridor, quiet enough that only I could hear it. She said that history was full of moments where someone told the truth clearly, and was ignored, simply because the truth was inconvenient to believe. She said we had done our part. We had warned them. Whatever came after this was no longer our responsibility to prevent. That same evening, a directive moved quietly through the highest levels of Earth's Defense Command. It did not lift every restriction. It did not announce anything publicly. But it authorized the acceleration of several programs that had been sitting dormant, waiting for exactly this kind of moment, the moment when it became undeniable that words alone would never be enough. I did not know the details then. I only knew, from the tone of the meetings I was suddenly excluded from, that something had shifted. For the next several years, life continued on the surface exactly as it had before. Trade continued. Colonies grew. Kepler's reach expanded from 400,000 people to nearly 600,000, and Grace kept sending pictures of those twin moons, along with updates about a small farm she had started with her partner near the edge of the settlement. I visited once, during a rare stretch of leave, and I remember standing in her kitchen at dusk, watching the sky turn colors that don't exist on Earth, thinking that this was exactly the kind of quiet, ordinary life our restraint was meant to protect. But beneath that surface, other things were happening. Coalition powers along the border, species who had grown confident during decades of unchallenged expansion, began watching Earth's territory with increasing interest. Reports crossed my desk about probing patrols testing the edges of our claimed space. Small violations that never quite justified a formal response, but never quite stopped either. I flagged several of them to my superiors. I was told, each time, that Earth's policy remained one of patience and de-escalation. I understood the policy. I had helped write parts of it, but I also began to feel something I had not expected to feel, a kind of low, steady unease, the sense of standing very still, while something large and hungry decided whether you were worth the risk of approaching. The unease sharpened the day I was assigned to a joint monitoring post near the edge of council space, working alongside observers from 3 other species, who did not bother hiding their opinion of our fleet. One of them, a Threll officer named Doran Vex, made a habit of commenting on how outdated he found our ship designs, how conservative our tactical doctrine seemed, compared to his own people's approach. I never argued with him. There was no point. He believed what the entire galaxy believed, that Earth had shown its hand years ago, and simply hadn't drawn a strong one. I thought about Marchetti's words often during those months. We had done our part. We had told them clearly, without exaggeration, exactly what kind of mistake they were making. It was no longer a question of whether the warning had been heard. It had been heard, recorded, filed, and dismissed. The only question left was how long it would take before someone tested that dismissal in the worst possible way, and what would be waiting for them when they did. I did not know, standing in that quiet monitoring post watching Doran Vex smirk at our sensor readings, that the answer to that question was closer than any of us understood. I did not know that within a matter of months, the twin moons over Kepler's reach would rise over a sky suddenly full of unfamiliar ships, or that the next time I saw Grace's name appear on my console, it would not be a picture of wheat fields at all. I only knew that the warning had been given, clearly and honestly, and that somewhere out past the edge of everything we had built, someone was about to find out exactly what we had chosen not to show them. The first ship that broke through the outer sensor net at Kepler's reach did not fire a single shot, and that was somehow worse than if it had. It simply appeared, sat there in high orbit for 6 long minutes, while the colony's defense grid scrambled to identify it, and then opened a channel to demand immediate surrender of all mining and agricultural infrastructure, in the name of what it called a lawful reclamation under Coalition Trade Code. I was 3 jumps away when the alert reached me, sitting in a briefing room with Laura Bennett going over patrol schedules, and I remember the exact second the message came through because Laura's hand froze over her tablet mid-sentence. Grace was on that colony. I knew it the moment I read the coordinates, and for the length of one breath I stopped being an officer, and became only a cousin, who had once stood in a kitchen watching 2 strange moons rise together. Then the breath ended, and I went back to being an officer, because that was the only version of me who could actually help her. The coalition behind the attack called itself the Ordain Compact, a partnership of 3 mid-tier powers, who had spent decades expanding along contested trade corridors, with almost no resistance. They had watched Earth's territory grow for years, watched our ships perform exactly the way every observer expected them to perform, adequate, unremarkable, nothing to fear. They had concluded, reasonably enough from their point of view, that a species this cautious would rather negotiate away a border colony than risk a real confrontation over it. They were counting on us behaving exactly the way we had trained them to expect. What they did not know, what almost nobody outside a very small circle of command staff knew, was that the ships stationed nearest to Kepler's reach were not the same ships the galaxy had grown used to watching. Over the preceding years, quietly and without announcement, several forward squadrons had been rotated out for retrofit and replaced with vessels built under programs that had never appeared in any trade demonstration or joint exercise. The crew's training on them had been rotated through classified postings that even their own families believed were routine deep space surveys. Nobody had lied about what those ships could do. Nobody had needed to. The Ordain Compact had simply never asked, because they had already decided they already knew the answer. Commander Ethan Marsh held the nearest fleet position, 3 jumps out, and it was his voice that came over the command channel first, steady in a way that told me he had trained for a moment exactly like this one without ever quite believing it would come. He requested authorization to respond under the accelerated engagement protocols, the ones written in the quiet months after the day of dismissal, the ones almost nobody outside high command had ever seen activated. Authorization came back within 90 seconds. I have sat in enough command rooms to know that 90 seconds is not slow. It is the sound of people who already knew exactly what they would do the moment this happened. I asked to go with the response fleet, and I was told no, that liaison officers stayed with the diplomatic track while the military handled the engagement. I argued, which was not something I usually did, and I was reminded, not unkindly, that Grace's colony needed people making clear decisions under pressure, not people who would be thinking about their cousin every time a console lit up red. I hated how right that was. I stayed behind, and I watched everything that followed through secondhand reports and delayed sensor feeds, which somehow made it worse, because I had time to imagine every version of what might be happening between each update. The first engagement lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes, against a coalition force that outnumbered our response squadron nearly 3-to-1 on paper. When the reports started coming in, they did not read the way any of us expected. The Ordain flagship, a heavily armored cruiser that had reportedly seen action in 3 separate border conflicts without taking meaningful damage, lost primary shielding within the first 90 seconds of contact. Its escort vessels, expecting to face weapons systems rated at the level our ships had always displayed, found themselves outmatched by margins their targeting computers struggled to even calculate correctly. One escort captain, according to the recovered communications, spent several precious seconds simply repeating a request for updated threat assessment data because the numbers his own systems were reporting did not match anything in his ship's tactical database. I listened to a recording of that exchange later, and there was a strange, almost human quality to the confusion in that captain's voice. It was not the sound of an enemy realizing he was outgunned. It was the sound of someone realizing the entire framework he had used to understand an opponent for 11 years had simply been wrong the whole time. Commander Marsh's fleet did not destroy the Ordained force outright. That was never the objective, and it was not who we were, whatever the coalition might have assumed about a species suddenly showing teeth. The engagement protocols were built around disabling and repelling, forcing withdrawal without turning the encounter into a massacre. Ships lost propulsion. Weapons arrays were disabled with a precision that left crews largely unharmed but utterly unable to continue the assault. Within 11 minutes, the Ordained force that had arrived expecting a simple, uncontested reclamation was retreating in a formation so ragged that even their own communications betrayed how little anyone had prepared for this outcome. It was not a clean victory. I want to be honest about that, because too many stories about moments like this pretend the cost was nothing. We lost a corvette during the engagement, a smaller vessel that had moved to shield a civilian transport attempting to evacuate outlying farms near the colony's edge. 6 crew members did not make it home. One of them was a young pilot named Oliver Dunn, 23 years old, who according to Marsh's later report had made the decision to hold position half a second longer than protocol required, so the transport could complete its jump. I never met him. I have thought about him more than almost anyone else in this entire story, because his name never appears in any of the official accounts of what happened at Kepler's Reach, and I think that is a mistake worth correcting here, plainly, in my own words. He held the line so strangers could leave. That is worth remembering. Grace made it out. I did not know that until nearly 4 hours after the engagement ended. 4 hours in which I refused every offer of rest, refused every suggestion that I step away from the comm station, because I needed to hear her name confirmed with my own ears, rather than read it on a casualty list I was too afraid to open. When her voice finally came through on a delayed civilian channel, shaky, exhausted, alive, I did something I had not done in front of colleagues since I was a very young officer. I put my head down on the console and did not move for almost a full minute. Nobody said anything about it. I think everyone in that room understood exactly what the silence meant. The days after the engagement were strange, in a way I had not anticipated. Word of what happened at Kepler's Reach spread through council channels faster than any diplomatic statement Earth had ever issued. Suddenly, delegations that had never once requested a private meeting with our representatives were requesting exactly that, quietly, urgently, through back channels that avoided the formal record. Doran Vex, the Threll officer who had spent months commenting on how outdated our ship designs were, sent a message to the Joint Monitoring Post asking, with what I can only describe as careful, controlled unease, whether the reports coming out of the border region were accurate. I did not answer him personally. I did not need to. The answer was already spreading through every corner of the galaxy, faster than any single message could travel. What struck me most, in those first days, was not the reaction of our enemies, but the reaction of our allies, the handful of smaller species who had aligned with Earth over the years, precisely because we had always presented ourselves as steady, restrained, unwilling to escalate. Some of them seemed unsettled, as though the version of us they had built relationships with had turned out to be a stranger, wearing a familiar face. Others, particularly the smaller colonies who had spent years living under the casual dominance of larger coalition powers, reached out with something closer to relief, even hope. I received a message from a representative of the Calren settlements, a small agricultural people who had lost territory to Ordain expansion twice in the past decade, asking simply whether Earth might be willing to discuss expanded defensive cooperation. I forwarded it up the chain with a note that I believed this was a request worth taking seriously. The Ordain Compact itself did not immediately withdraw its broader ambitions, and I want to be clear about that, because the galaxy does not reorganize itself after a single battle, however dramatic. Reports continued to filter in over the following weeks of continued patrols along contested borders, continued posturing in council sessions, continued insistence in public statements that the engagement at Kepler's Reach had been a temporary tactical anomaly rather than evidence of anything larger. I read those statements with a strange, quiet certainty that they were exactly the kind of thing people say right before they make the same mistake a second time, only bigger. I returned briefly to Kepler's Reach, nearly 3 weeks after the engagement, officially to assist with the diplomatic aftermath, unofficially, because I needed to see the wheat field still standing with my own eyes. Grace met me at the transport platform looking thinner than I remembered, her hands trembling slightly in a way she tried and failed to hide, but alive, and stubborn, and already talking about replanting the fields that had been damaged during the evacuation. She told me she had watched the battle from a shelter half a kilometer from her farmhouse, watched unfamiliar ships trade fire in a sky she had once described to me as strange and beautiful, and that the strangest part of the entire experience was not the fear, but the moment afterward. Standing outside the shelter, watching one of our own ships pass low overhead on its way to secure the perimeter, and realizing that the sound it made, the shape it moved in, was nothing like anything she had ever seen in any recruitment broadcast or trade demonstration back on Earth. She asked me, standing in that half-damaged kitchen with the twin moons just beginning to rise outside the window, whether this was who we had always been, quietly capable of far more than we ever showed. I told her the truth, because she had earned it more than anyone. I told her yes. I told her we had said so, clearly, years earlier, to a room full of people who chose not to believe us. I told her that the warning had never been a threat. It had been an honest description of a choice, and the choice had simply been tested for the first time in the worst possible way, at the edge of a colony full of people who deserved better than to become the proof of something the rest of the galaxy had refused to accept on our word alone. She was quiet for a long moment after that, looking out at the fields where the damage was already being cleared away by neighbors who had lost almost as much as she had. Then she said something I have carried with me ever since, something simple enough that I almost missed how much weight it carried. She said that she hoped, now that the warning had finally been proven true, that it would be the last time it needed proving at all. I did not have the heart to tell her, standing in that kitchen with the moons rising outside, that I doubted very much this would be the last time. The ordained compact was only one power among many who had spent years mistaking our restraint for our limit. Somewhere in the wider galaxy, other coalitions, other alliances, other confident, expansionist powers were still watching the reports out of Kepler's Reach and deciding, in exactly the same way, that this had to be an exception rather than a rule. I understood, standing there, that Earth's long silence about its true capabilities had ended, publicly and permanently, whether anyone in high command wanted it to or not. What I did not yet understand was how far our own leadership was willing to go, now that the leash, as some in the council had once mockingly called it, had finally begun to come off. The formal announcement came 11 days after I returned from Kepler's Reach, and I found out about it the same way most of the galaxy did, sitting in front of a screen with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, while Earth's Secretary of Defense, a calm, unhurried woman named Vivian Holt, addressed the council chamber directly for the first time in Earth's history, without a single prepared apology in her tone. I had expected the announcement to feel triumphant. Some part of me had almost wanted it to, after everything Kepler's Reach had cost. Instead it felt quiet, almost businesslike, the way a person explains a decision they made a long time ago and simply never got around to mentioning. Holt stood at the podium and told the assembled delegates that the restraint policy Earth had operated under since first contact was officially and permanently lifted. She did not frame it as a threat. She framed it as a correction, the closing of a gap between what the galaxy believed about us and what had always actually been true. She reminded them, in the same measured tone Marchetti had used years earlier, that this moment had been announced in advance. She read a portion of Marchetti's original statement back into the record, word for word, and I watched several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats as they realized the warning they had dismissed years earlier was being quoted back to them in full, on the record, with nowhere left to hide from the fact that they had heard it and chosen not to act on it. Then Holt did something I had not expected. She began to describe, in general terms, exactly what had been held back. She spoke about propulsion systems capable of sustained speeds that made the ships the galaxy had grown used to watching look like relics from an earlier age. She spoke about material science advances that allowed our hulls to absorb damage that would have crippled anything the Council had previously encountered from us. She spoke, carefully, about defensive and medical technologies that had quietly extended the survivability of our crews far beyond what any external observer had ever calculated. She did not reveal everything. There is always more behind a door than the first room you're shown, and I understood even then that some programs would remain classified regardless of how far the unshackling went. But what she did reveal was enough to reshape, permanently, the assumptions the entire galaxy had built about what Earth was capable of. I watched the reaction ripple through the chamber the way I had watched the dismissal ripple through it years earlier, except this time the ripple moved in the opposite direction. Delegates who had spent a decade treating our representatives as a minor curiosity suddenly found themselves requesting immediate private briefings. Trade partners who had quietly delayed negotiations with Earth for years, assuming there was no urgency in dealing with a species of our apparent size, began sending messages within hours, asking to expedite talks that had been sitting untouched for months. It was strange, watching an entire political order reorganize itself around information that had, technically, always been available to anyone willing to listen the first time it was said aloud. The Ordained Compact's official response, when it came 2 days later, was a masterclass in the specific kind of denial that powerful institutions produce when they are unwilling to admit a miscalculation. Their representative stood before the council and characterized the engagement at Kepler's Reach as an isolated incident involving experimental equipment, insisted that Earth's broader capabilities remained unproven at scale, and suggested, not quite directly but unmistakably, that Holt's announcement was a bluff, designed to discourage further coalition activity along contested borders. I remember feeling something close to disbelief as I listened to that statement, not because it was unexpected, but because it demonstrated so clearly how deeply some institutions can commit to an assumption even after watching it fail in front of them. Commander Marsh, who had been quietly promoted to oversee a newly formed border defense initiative in the weeks following Kepler's Reach, put it to me plainly during a briefing I sat in on shortly after the ordained statement was released. He said that some people only learn from a warning. Others only learn from a single failure. And a certain kind of person, the kind who has built an entire career on the assumption that they understand the balance of power in a room, will only learn from a second failure, large enough that it cannot possibly be explained away. He did not say it with satisfaction. He said it the way a doctor describes a diagnosis they had hoped, without much real hope, to be wrong about. The weeks that followed, the unshackling announcement, brought a strange kind of acceleration to everything. Earth's shipyards, which had spent years producing vessels calibrated to appear modest and unremarkable, began openly retooling for full production of the designs that had previously existed only in classified programs. This was not hidden. It was, deliberately, made visible, because part of what Holt's strategy demanded was that the galaxy see the shift happening in real time, rather than simply hear about it after the fact. I toured one of these facilities during an official liaison visit, standing on an observation platform overlooking a construction bay large enough to house 6 vessels at once, watching engineers assemble a hull configuration I had genuinely never seen before despite years of security clearance that I had assumed gave me visibility into most of what Earth was building. I asked one of the senior engineers, a quiet, precise woman named Priya Desai, how long these designs had existed before Kepler's Reach forced their reveal. She told me some of the underlying research dated back nearly 2 decades, long before Earth had even established regular contact with the Council. Developed initially as contingency work by scientists who had wanted to ensure that whatever the galaxy turned out to be, humanity would never be forced to negotiate from a position of true weakness. She said the programs had been maintained quietly, funded through channels most of the public never saw, staffed by people who understood they might spend their entire careers working on technology that would never be publicly acknowledged. I asked her how it felt, watching that secrecy finally end. She thought about it for a long moment before answering, and then she said it felt like exhaling after holding a breath for 20 years, and that she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with relief. Not every part of the unshackling was smooth. There were difficult conversations within Earth's own government about how far the reveal should go, arguments between officials who believed full transparency would deter future aggression, and those who believed some capabilities should remain hidden, regardless of what had already been shown. I sat in on several of these debates in a limited capacity, and I remember one exchange in particular, between Holt and a more cautious colleague named Adrian Voss, who argued that revealing too much too quickly would simply teach potential adversaries exactly what to prepare countermeasures against. Holt's response stayed with me. She said that the entire point of the previous decade had been proof through action rather than proof through demonstration, and that if Earth continued hiding its full strength indefinitely, the galaxy would simply repeat the same mistake with the next hidden capability, and the next, endlessly, until every eventual reveal cost more lives than the last one had. She said there had to be a point where the warning became complete enough that no reasonable actor could claim ignorance again. I do not know if she was entirely right. I know that I understood, listening to her, why she had been chosen for that role. The most difficult part of this period, for me personally, was watching how quickly some of our former critics attempted to reposition themselves as though they had never doubted us at all. Doran Vex, the Threll officer who had spent months openly mocking our ship designs at the Joint Monitoring Post, sent me a message during this period that read almost like nothing had happened between us, requesting cooperation on an updated tactical assessment framework, as though his previous comments had simply evaporated from both our memories. I responded professionally, because that was my job, but I did not pretend to forget, and I noted, carefully, in my own private records, exactly how quickly certainty can dissolve once its consequences become personal rather than theoretical. Grace called me during this period too, from Kepler's Reach, where reconstruction was continuing steadily. She told me the colony had begun receiving new defensive infrastructure as part of the broader border initiative. Visible installations this time, not the quiet, unremarkable systems that had failed to deter the Ordain Compact in the first place. She said watching the new installations go up gave the colonists a strange mixture of comfort and unease. Comfort, because the danger felt genuinely addressed for the first time. Unease, because it meant acknowledging, permanently, that the quiet farming life they had chosen now existed within reach of forces large enough to require this kind of protection. I told her I understood both feelings completely, because I had been carrying exactly that same mixture since the day the alarms first went off on that bridge, since before that even, since the day I stood in the observation gallery and watched Marchetti's warning disappear into the Council's polite indifference. There was a particular moment during this period that I think captures the shift better than any policy announcement could. A coalition of smaller, previously neutral species, watching the reorganization of power happening around Earth's reveal, requested a joint session specifically to discuss what they called a revised understanding of regional security. I attended as part of the liaison delegation, and I watched representatives who had never previously acknowledged Earth's relevance in any meaningful capacity sit forward in their seats, listening carefully, taking notes, treating our delegation's input with a seriousness that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. It was not admiration exactly. It was something closer to recalculation, the visible process of an entire diplomatic order updating its assumptions in real time. I want to be honest about something here, because it would be easy to tell this part of the story as a simple, satisfying moment of vindication, and it was not entirely that. There was satisfaction in it, I will not pretend otherwise. There is a particular kind of relief in being proven right after years of being politely dismissed, but there was also a growing weight to it. A recognition that this new visibility came with new expectations, new responsibilities, and new dangers that a quieter, less capable Earth would never have had to face. Powers that respect strength also fear it, and fear produces its own kind of instability. I understood, watching the council chamber reorganize itself around us, that Earth had traded one set of risks for another, and that the version of humanity walking into this new chapter of galactic politics would need to be as careful with its power as it had once been careful with its silence. The Ordain Compact's continued denial did not last much longer. Within a month of Holt's announcement, intelligence reports began arriving that suggested the Compact was quietly mobilizing additional forces along the border, not in open aggression yet, but in a pattern that Commander Marsh's staff recognized immediately as preparation rather than routine patrol activity. I remember sitting in a strategy briefing where those reports were presented, watching the room absorb the information with a kind of grim, unsurprised acceptance. Nobody in that room seemed shocked that a single humiliating defeat had not been enough to fully reshape an entire coalition's strategic doctrine. Institutions built on decades of unchallenged expansion rarely abandon their core assumptions after one loss, however dramatic. They look for reasons to explain it away, and having found none that satisfied their own leadership, some among the ordained compact appeared to be preparing for a larger, more decisive attempt to prove their original assumptions correct. Commander Marsh, standing at the front of that briefing room, said something I have thought about many times since. He said that the galaxy had just watched Earth reveal the first layer of what it had been holding back, and that some among the ordained leadership seemed to have concluded, astonishingly, that this meant we had shown everything, rather than understanding it as exactly what it was, the beginning of a longer, more complete unveiling that would only continue if they forced our hand further. He said, quietly, that if the compact chose to test us again at that scale, the response this time would not be limited to disabling ships and forcing a retreat. He did not say it with anger. He said it the way a person describes an outcome they have already accepted as inevitable, and are simply waiting to arrive. I left that briefing thinking about Oliver Dunn, the young pilot who had held his position half a second too long so a transport full of strangers could escape, and about the 6 crew members lost defending a colony that should never have needed defending in the first place, if a single warning, given clearly and honestly years earlier, had simply been believed. I thought about Grace, standing in her half-rebuilt kitchen, hoping the proof we had given would be the last time it needed proving. I understood, walking out of that briefing room into a hallway lined with officers who no longer moved with the careful, restrained posture of a species trying not to draw attention to itself, that we were standing at the edge of something larger than a single engagement, larger even than a single policy announcement. The ordained compact had chosen, twice now, to test an assumption the rest of the galaxy was already beginning to abandon. I did not yet know exactly what form their next attempt would take, or how many more names I would eventually have to remember the way I remembered Oliver Dunn's. I only knew that the quiet, unremarkable version of Earth the galaxy had spent a decade underestimating was gone for good, and that whatever came next would be measured against a very different, very complete understanding of exactly what we had chosen, for so long, not to show them. The ordained compact struck again 43 days after Marsh's warning in that briefing room, and this time they did not send a single ship to test the waters. They sent a full invasion force, nearly 200 vessels drawn from all 3 member powers of the coalition, aimed not at a single border colony, but at a coordinated push meant to seize an entire cluster of systems along Earth's frontier, in a single, overwhelming stroke. I learned about it the way I learned about most turning points in this story, sitting somewhere far from the actual danger, watching numbers scroll across a screen, while people I knew were the ones facing what those numbers actually meant. I had been reassigned by then, moved into a coordination role at a forward command post, closer to the border, close enough that when the invasion force dropped out of warp across 4 separate systems simultaneously, I felt the alert hit my station less than 90 seconds after the first contact reports came in. Laura Bennett was there with me again, the way she had been on that first bridge months earlier, and I remember the look she gave me before either of us said a word, a look that said we both understood exactly what kind of day this was going to be. Commander Marsh commanded the primary defense fleet from a position near the largest of the 4 targeted systems, a densely populated cluster that included both established colonies and several newer settlements still in early development. I want to describe what happened there honestly, without exaggeration, because the temptation in a story like this is always to make the battle feel effortless, a simple demonstration of overwhelming superiority against an enemy who never stood a chance. That is not what happened, and I do not want to tell it that way. The ordained compact had learned something from Kepler's Reach, even if their leadership refused to admit it publicly. Their formations were tighter, their targeting patterns more adaptive, their command structure clearly restructured to account for capabilities they had previously underestimated. This was not an enemy walking blindly into a slaughter. This was an enemy who believed, with the particular stubborn confidence of an institution, unwilling to accept a single lesson as final, that a larger force applied with better preparation could still achieve what a smaller force had failed to achieve months earlier. For the first several minutes of the engagement, it was genuinely uncertain how the battle would unfold. Defensive lines across 2 of the 4 targeted systems held, but held under real strain, with several vessels taking damage severe enough to force emergency withdrawal to repair stations. I listened to communications from a defense group holding position near one of the newer settlements, a colony called Astor Hollow, that had only been established 18 months earlier, and I heard the strain in the voices of officers managing a defense that was working, but working at a cost that nobody in that command post wanted to accept as simply the price of doing business. It was during this stretch of the engagement that Earth's full capability, the part that even Holt's announcement had only partially revealed, became visible for the first time. A secondary fleet, one that had not been publicly acknowledged even after the unshackling announcement, arrived at the two most heavily contested systems, roughly 12 minutes into the engagement. I did not know, before that moment, that such a fleet existed. I do not believe most people in my position knew. I watched the tactical display update in near disbelief, as ships with configurations I had never seen, not even during my tour of the shipyard with Priya Desai months earlier, moved into formation with a coordination that made the rest of our fleet look almost slow by comparison. Commander Marsh later described the arrival of that secondary fleet, in a debrief I was permitted to attend, as the moment the Ordained Compact's entire strategic model finally, completely collapsed. Their targeting computers, built around assumptions calibrated even after Kepler's reach, simply could not account for what they were now facing. Ships that had been holding steady under real strain suddenly found their attackers withdrawing, disengaging, in some cases retreating in formations so disorganized that Compact Command struggled to re-establish any coherent order at all. The battle did not end quickly, and I want to be clear about that, because a battle involving 4 systems and hundreds of vessels does not resolve itself in a tidy, dramatic instant, the way stories sometimes suggest. It took nearly 6 more hours before the last significant pocket of compact resistance either withdrew or surrendered. 6 hours during which I did not leave my station. 6 hours during which I thought, more than once, about Oliver Dunn, about the 6 crew members lost at Kepler's reach, about Grace's half-rebuilt kitchen, about every name that had already been paid before this larger battle even began. The human cost of that day was not small, and I refuse to let this story pretend otherwise. 14 Earth vessels were lost across the 4 systems, along with 211 crew members who did not survive the engagement. I read every name on that list personally, over the following days, because it felt important to me that someone did, that the cost of proving a warning true was not allowed to disappear into a simple summary of tactical success. One of those names was a young defense coordinator at Astor Hollow named Kavya Rao, who according to the reports coordinated a civilian evacuation from a settlement under direct fire for almost 40 minutes before the shelter she was working from took a direct hit. She was 26 years old. She had been on the colony less than a year. I never met her, and I think about her nearly as often as I think about Oliver Dunn, because both of them represent something the official record too easily reduces to a single line in a longer casualty report. A full life, cut short, in defense of people who would never know their names. The turning point of the broader campaign, the moment that finally forced the Ordained Compact's leadership to abandon their denial entirely, came roughly 2 days after the main engagement, when a smaller task force under Marsh's command intercepted a Compact command vessel attempting to withdraw from the border region entirely, carrying several senior officials who had personally overseen the invasion's planning. Among them was a coalition administrator named General Renar Kesh, a name I had encountered before only in intelligence briefings, described consistently as one of the primary architects of Ordained expansion policy over the preceding decade, and, as I later confirmed through the formal record, the same official who had stood before the council years earlier and dismissed Officer Marchetti's original warning with a short, involuntary laugh, quickly covered by a cough. I was present, in a limited liaison capacity, during the formal proceedings that followed Kesh's interception, and I want to describe that moment carefully, because it is the closest this story comes to what people might expect from a dramatic confrontation, and the reality of it was quieter, and in some ways heavier, than I had imagined it would be. Kesh was brought before a joint panel that included both military and diplomatic representatives, myself among the latter in an observational role. He did not appear defiant. He appeared tired, and older than I remembered from the recordings I had studied. A man whose confidence had been built on assumptions that had simply stopped being true sometime in the last year, without his institution ever fully adjusting to the change. I was permitted to speak briefly during the proceedings, in my capacity as one of the few officers present who had witnessed both the original dismissal years earlier and the consequences that followed. I did not gloat. I want to be honest about that, because part of me had imagined, over the preceding months, that this moment might feel satisfying in a simple way, and it did not. I told Kesh, plainly, that the warning his own government had dismissed had never been a threat, had never been an attempt to inflate our own importance, had simply been the truth, offered honestly, at a moment when believing it could have prevented every death that followed on both sides of this conflict. I told him that I had personally read the names of 211 crew members lost defending systems that should never have needed defending, and that I hoped, whatever came next in the negotiations his own leadership would now be forced into, that the cost of this particular lesson would finally be enough to prevent a third one. Kesh did not offer much in response. He said, quietly, that his government had believed Earth's restraint represented the full measure of our ability, and that this belief had not been unreasonable, given the information available to them at the time. I told him, and I meant it, that the information had always been available. It had been said aloud, on the record, in front of the entire council, years before the first shot was ever fired at Kepler's reach. The failure had never been a lack of information. The failure had been a refusal to believe information that was inconvenient to an existing set of assumptions. I do not know if he accepted that distinction. I know that he did not argue with it. The formal terms that followed Kesh's interception took weeks to fully negotiate, and I will describe that process in more detail shortly, but the immediate military outcome was clear within days. The ordained compact withdrew entirely from the border region, formally requested a ceasefire through council mediation, and, for the first time in the history of their interactions with Earth, sent a delegation to open negotiations without a single precondition attached, an acknowledgement, unspoken but unmistakable, that the balance of power between our two governments had shifted in a way that could no longer be denied, minimized, or explained away as an isolated tactical anomaly. I returned briefly to Aster Hollow during this period, part of a liaison team assessing reconstruction needs, and I stood at the edge of a memorial that had already begun forming near the settlement's central square, informal at first, handwritten names and small personal items left by neighbors who had lost people during the defense. I found Kavya Rao's name among them, written on a simple wooden marker beside a small collection of tools that had apparently belonged to her, left there by colonists who had known her only 18 months, but had clearly come to care for her deeply in that short time. I stood there for a long while, longer than I had planned to, thinking about how strange it was that a warning given so plainly, so honestly, years earlier, had still required this much loss, before it was finally, completely believed. Grace called me again during this period, and for the first time in the entire course of these events, her voice sounded something closer to steady, rather than shaken. She told me the colony had received word of the ceasefire before I had, spreading through civilian channels faster than the official announcement had managed to travel through military ones, and that for the first time since the original attack on Kepler's reach, the community had gathered openly in the town square, not in fear, but in something closer to quiet, exhausted relief. She asked me if this meant it was finally over. I told her the truth, because she had earned that from me every time, and I was not going to stop now. I told her the fighting, for now, appeared to be over. I told her that whatever came next, the negotiations, the new terms, the reshaping of how Earth would be treated across the wider galaxy, that part was only just beginning, and that I did not yet know exactly what shape it would take. I told her I would tell her everything, as it happened, the way I always had, because she deserved to hear it from someone who had been there, rather than from a summary, written by people who had never stood in her kitchen, watching two moons rise together. I left Aster Hollow a few days later, carrying with me a small, private list I had started keeping, without quite deciding to. A list of names: Oliver Dunn, Kavya Rao, and the others whose stories I had gathered piece by piece across the preceding months. People whose lives had become the final, undeniable proof of a warning that should never have needed proving in the first place. I did not know, boarding the transport back toward the negotiation table where Earth's future relationship with the Council would finally be decided, exactly what terms we would demand, or what kind of galaxy would exist on the other side of those negotiations. I only knew that whatever came next needed to be shaped, at least in part, by the memory of every name on that list, because a warning ignored once could perhaps be forgiven as an honest mistake. A warning ignored twice, at this cost, could not be allowed to happen a third time. The negotiation chamber looked exactly the same as it had the day Marchetti gave her original warning, The same curved rows of delegate seating, the same pale light filtering down from the high windows, and I found myself standing in almost the exact spot in the observation gallery where I had once watched a room full of powerful people decide, collectively, without ever quite saying it aloud, that a young species from a small blue planet could not possibly mean what it said. This time the room was different, not in its architecture but in the way people held themselves inside it. I watched delegates who had once treated our representatives as a polite formality, now leaning forward, listening carefully, taking notes on every word. Vivian Holt led Earth's delegation into the negotiations, with Commander Marsh present in an advisory capacity, and a full diplomatic team supporting the formal talks. I was included as part of that team. In recognition, I was told quietly by a superior, of the fact that I had been present at nearly every major turning point of the preceding year, from the original dismissal through the battle at Astor Hollow. I did not feel particularly honored by the assignment. I felt, mostly, a kind of tired responsibility, the sense that I owed it to the names on my private list to make sure whatever we negotiated here actually meant something. The ordained Compact's delegation arrived without General Kesh, whose formal role in coalition leadership had been quietly dissolved following the interception, replaced by a younger administrator named Talia Vorn, whose opening statement surprised me with its directness. She did not attempt to minimize what had happened. She acknowledged, plainly, that her government had repeatedly and dangerously misjudged Earth's capabilities and intentions, first through simple dismissal of Marchetti's original warning, then through a refusal to accept the outcome at Kepler's Reach as anything other than an anomaly, and finally, through a larger invasion that had cost lives on both sides, in service of an assumption that had already been proven false. I appreciated the honesty, even as I understood it was partly strategic, an attempt to secure more favorable terms by demonstrating good faith early in the process. Sincerity and strategy are not always opposites. Sometimes they simply arrive in the room together. The negotiations themselves stretched across nearly 6 weeks, and I will not pretend every session held the same dramatic weight as the moments that led up to them. Much of diplomacy, even diplomacy following a war, consists of careful, incremental work, adjusting language in trade agreements, establishing verification mechanisms for demilitarized border zones, negotiating the specific terms under which displaced colonists from both sides would be resettled or compensated. I sat through long sessions on tariff structures and resource allocation that had nothing dramatic about them at all, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did not resent that slowness. After everything that had led to this room, the tedium of careful, detailed peacemaking felt like its own kind of relief. What mattered most to me, and to the delegation as a whole, was not the specific language of any single trade clause, but the broader shift in how Earth would be treated going forward, within the structure of the Council itself. Holt made this a central priority from the opening days of negotiation, not framed as a demand for dominance, but as a correction long overdue. She proposed, and eventually secured, a permanent seat for Earth on the Council's Senior Security Committee, the body responsible for coordinating major defense and border policy across the wider Council territory, a body from which Earth had been excluded since first contact, on the grounds that our fleet numbers and history in the galaxy did not yet warrant that level of influence. Watching that proposal pass, with even the ordained delegation abstaining rather than opposing it outright, felt like watching the final, formal acknowledgement of everything Marchetti had said years earlier, finally being written into permanent record. Holt also insisted on the creation of a new formal process within Council procedure, one that required any warning issued by a member species regarding its own military capabilities or defensive posture to be formally logged, reviewed, and responded to within a fixed time frame, rather than simply noted and set aside as our original warning had been. She argued, and the Council ultimately agreed, that the entire tragedy of the preceding year, all the losses on both sides, had stemmed not from any lack of honesty on Earth's part, but from an institutional culture that allowed inconvenient warnings to be dismissed without consequence. I sat in the gallery the day that procedural change was formally adopted, and found myself thinking about Oliver Dunn and Kavya Rao, about how a simple change in institutional habit, adopted years earlier, might have meant neither of them ever needed to become names on a private list I kept, because I was afraid the official record would forget them. The most difficult negotiation, for me personally, involved the question of accountability for the invasion itself, what consequences the ordained compact would face beyond the military defeat they had already suffered. Some voices within Earth's own delegation argued for significant punitive measures, territorial concessions, extended economic restrictions, terms severe enough to ensure the compact could never again attempt anything similar. Others, including Holt herself, argued for a more measured approach, one that held the coalition clearly accountable, without crippling it so completely that it collapsed into the kind of desperate instability that so often produces even greater conflict down the line. I found myself, somewhat unexpectedly, agreeing more with the measured position, not because I had forgiven what happened, I do not think I ever fully will, but because I kept thinking about what Marsh had said, quietly, in that briefing room months earlier, about institutions only sometimes learning from a single failure. I did not want the terms we set to simply plant the seeds of a future coalition's grievance, waiting decades to resurface in some new form. The final terms reflected that balance, as closely as any negotiated agreement ever can. The ordained compact agreed to significant, verifiable demilitarization along the contested border regions, formal reparations to support the reconstruction of Astor Hollow and the other affected settlements, and binding participation in the new warning review process Holt had championed, applied retroactively to ensure their own future statements would carry the same weight and scrutiny that ours should have carried from the very beginning. It was not a perfect resolution. I do not believe perfect resolutions exist in situations built on this much loss. But it was, I came to believe, a fair one, shaped by people who understood that the goal was not to punish an entire coalition for the mistakes of a leadership that had already begun changing, but to build a structure sturdy enough that the next warning any species offered, ours or anyone else's, would actually be heard the first time it was spoken. I want to end this account not in the negotiation chamber, but back at Kepler's Reach, where I returned one final time, roughly 2 months after the formal terms were signed, invited by Grace to attend a small gathering held in the town square, part memorial, part celebration, marking the first full harvest since the original attack. The wheat fields she had shown me in pictures years earlier, and shown me again in person during quieter, gentler days before any of this began, had been fully restored, gold and full under a sky where the twin moons were just beginning their slow rise as the gathering started. Grace found me near the edge of the square, standing quietly with a plate of food I had barely touched, watching neighbors who had once huddled together in shelters, now laughing together, over a meal built from a harvest that had almost never happened. She asked me, the way she always did, plainly and without softening the question, whether I thought it had been worth it, everything that had happened since that first warning years ago, everything it had cost to finally be believed. I thought about Oliver Dunn holding his position half a second longer than protocol required. I thought about Kavya Rao coordinating an evacuation for 40 minutes before the shelter she was working from took a direct hit. I thought about General Kesh's tired voice, admitting that his government had simply chosen not to believe information that had always been available to them. I thought about a new seat at a table we had once been excluded from, and a new procedure that meant the next honest warning, ours or anyone else's, would not simply be filed away and forgotten. I told her I did not think worth it was quite the right way to frame it, because nothing about this had felt like a trade freely chosen. It had felt, instead, like the long, difficult consequence of a warning that should have been believed the first time it was spoken, and wasn't. I told her that the true measure of whether any of it mattered would not be found in this harvest, or even in the new terms signed at the negotiation table, but in whether the galaxy, having finally been forced to listen once, would choose to keep listening going forward, to us and to every other quieter, more restrained voice it had once been too comfortable dismissing. She was quiet for a moment, watching the moons climb slowly over the restored fields, and then she said something I have held on to since, something I think captures better than anything else what this entire year had actually been about. She said that restraint had never been our weakness. It had always been our choice. And now, finally, the rest of the galaxy understood the difference well enough to be careful about which version of that choice they provoked next time. I stood beside her in the gathering dusk, watching neighbors who had survived so much share a meal together, under a sky that had once been full of unfamiliar ships, and was now simply, quietly, home. I did not know exactly what the next chapter of Earth's place in this wider galaxy would look like. I knew only that whatever came next We had finally, fully, and permanently made ourselves impossible to ignore, not through conquest, not through cruelty, but through the simple, costly, undeniable act of proving, in the worst possible circumstances, that we had told the truth all along.